Thank you very much for that introduction and for hosting me today. I know when people hear money in elections, talking about politics, sometimes the walls go up. And so I like to just start by mentioning that we are fiercely nonpartisan and strictly here to educate people about this issue. So we're not going to be ranting about one candidate or any party or anything like that. And I'm going to do a little, kind of try to move through this a little quicker today. So bear with me. I want to start by just asking you to think of one word that you think describes the current state of politics in the United States. Okay? And the Pew Research Center did just this. This is a prominent research center. They asked Americans to think of one word to describe our current state of politics, and this is what it came up with. The bigger the word, the more often it was cited, and you can see divisive, corrupt, messy, bad. So it's not good, basically. And let's dig into that a little bit. You know, one of the things I'm going to do is just try to draw a connection between this perception of our government to this issue of money in politics. So, you know, Americans are living in this reality, and they want a better one. How we currently view our system is that it's influenced only by big donors, and people would rather have a system that's influenced by their vote and their voice. They have elections that are swayed by big money, and people want a process that is fair. Fairness is real American value. We see it even in the four-way test, fair to all concerned. And we want government who represent the interests of the people rather than the interests of just a few. When we look at the total spending in recent years, you can see that it has been skyrocketing. This is in the billions with a B. There was a big jump between 2004 and 2008 from I think it was 1.5 billion to 5 billion, and then a massive jump in between 2016 and 2020 up to 14 billion. And we are, the 9 billion in 2022 is the most expensive midterm ever, and we're on pace to break all records again in 2024. Then we break it down a little bit. These are the top 10 battleground states in 2022. We can see that it now costs about $500 million to elect a senator from a swing state. Maine isn't on here because we didn't have a Senate race in 2022, but we did have one in 2020, and that set all records here in Maine. $200 million was spent in that race, mostly in the form of negative attack ads. And the vast majority of this money is now coming from outside the state, especially when you live in a state like Maine. In that $200 million Senate race, 93% of the money in that race came from outside of the state, from people who couldn't vote for the candidate they were funding. So in this, you can see the red is money that comes from outside the state, and the blue is money from inside the state. This is David Trahan. He runs the Maine Sportsmen's Alliance. They're a fairly sizable advocacy group in Maine, but he said that in the 2020 U.S. Senate race, it was like being in an avalanche under snow and no one could hear them. They were one of the like I said, one of the larger advocacy groups in the state, and even they couldn't find ad time to get their message out there with competing against all these national interests. And it's not just that it's a massive amount of money, it's that it's concentrated. So 93% of all super PAC spending comes from just 1% of donors. So it's a vast majority of the money comes from just a small handful of individuals. And this one is always a very concerning statistic to me. This is the percentage of, basically what this shows is 93% of congressional candidates dating back all the way to the year 2000, the candidate with the most money won 93% of the time. So almost always the candidate with the most money wins their election. It's actually a better predictor than most of the national polls out there. You just look to the candidate who raised the most money, you can almost guarantee that they're going to win their election. And the result of this is that people are losing faith in our institutions. And this is an ongoing study, again, by the Pew Research Center. They ask every year a series of questions to Americans. And one of the questions is, do you trust the government to do what is right? And that number has been steadily declining since the 60s to an all-time low at 16% in the last poll. And when asked to point to why they think that this is happening, why do people don't trust the government, what is the biggest threat to our government, the vast majority of people point to money in politics. And this is poll after poll. This is from a CBS poll, but this is a common response. 86% point to the influence of money in politics as the primary driver. So what is this money? How does it make its way into our system? Dark money is something we hear a lot about, but people aren't quite sure exactly what that means. Basically, it's money where the source is not disclosed. And if you're new to the conversation, you might be surprised that we even have money in our political system that is undisclosed. But there are a couple of ways that this money can make its way into our system. So for the standard donor, you're going to give your money directly to a candidate or an issue. That money is fully disclosed. It is regulated. It's limited to $3,300 per election for a candidate or $5,000 to a regular PAC. And you have to provide your name, your address, your employer, your occupation. So it's fully disclosed. But then there are these other avenues that if you're a very wealthy donor, you can pursue. One of them is super PACs, which have no limit. They can raise and spend as much money as they want, but they do have to disclose their donors. They have to list the names of their donors. And then we have 501c4 nonprofits that often will pose as like some advocacy social welfare group. They have usually a nice sounding name like Grandmothers for Apple Pie, but all they do is raise money for candidates. They don't have anything to do with apple pie or grandmothers. And they don't have to disclose their donors. So they can raise and spend as much money as they want, and they don't have to tell you where the money's coming from. This is how foreign money makes its way into our elections. It's totally legal for foreign interests to spend money, give money to a 501c4, and for that group to then take that money and spend it advocating for or against a candidate or an issue. I'm just going to skip over a few slides for time's sake. So I want to, just touch quickly on how things got this way. It wasn't always this way. When we think about how and when we should regulate elections, that's a question we would normally look to the Constitution for an answer. And it does sort of provide an answer. It says that the time, place, and manner of holding elections is decided first by the states, by state legislatures, and then Congress can come in and set some rules for federal elections, but they can't totally displace the rules in place by states. So for a long, long time, states were in charge of regulating their elections. They could put laws in place to limit or require certain limit sources of money or require disclosure of that money. Then fast forward to 1974. In response to the Watergate scandal, Congress passed the Federal Elections Campaign Act. It was the largest campaign reform act ever passed in this country. It established the FEC and initially implemented strict limits on money given to candidates and money spent independent of candidates. And this led to a lawsuit called Buckley v. Vallejo. And this is a very important case that really shaped the current landscape of our campaign finance laws. And basically what Buckley v. Vallejo said was there are two types of political spending. There is money that you give directly to a candidate, and then there is money that you spend independent of a candidate. And money that you give directly to a candidate or a candidate's campaign should be regulated, should be limited, and should be disclosed. But money spent adjacent, basically money that if I wanted to just go out and spend the money by myself, advocating for this individual, without the direct collaboration of that campaign, they said that money is a form of free speech and cannot be limited. So we have now a divergence of this two types of spending, and this led to the creation of super PACs and independent expenditure organizations that can now raise and spend as much money as they want. Buckley v. Vallejo was just episode 1 of this Netflix special. Here are episodes 2 through 9. There have been a series of Supreme Court cases over the last 50 years. A big one that a lot of people know about is Citizens United. Citizens United was the first time that the court said that you can't distinguish between the types of spenders. So Buckley said you can't put limits on spending. Citizens United said that artificial entities can also spend. So unions, corporations, nonprofits can spend and raise and spend as much money as they want. And one of the interesting things I do find about Citizens United is that the justices basically said that this money will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our government. And I want to just go back to this slide. This shows the public trust in government declining since that around that same time as the Buckley v. Vallejo court ruling. And I'm going to just touch quickly on a solution, but first I want to bring it a little closer to home. This is a recent issue in Maine. Last year, Maine voters voted in a referendum to prohibit foreign government spending in state elections. It won by 86%. It's the largest margin of victory of any referendum in the state's history. So it was very popular, but it was immediately challenged in court. And the plaintiffs are foreign interests, foreign-owned corporations, and media companies. And what they said is that these entities have a First Amendment right to spend money in our elections. And the only reason that they feel that this argument is one that's available to them is because the Supreme Court, through years of precedence, has said that this is an argument that is available to them, that this independent spending is a form of speech. But now even these foreign interests are saying that they have a First Amendment right to spend this money in our elections as well. So it's likely that will be overturned. There's a ruling on October 10th. We'll know more about exactly how that lawsuit's going to shake out. And so how do we kind of restore our ability to put limits on elections? American Promise does advocate for an amendment which would restore the ability to put limits, would give that power back to the states where it lived for a very, very long time. So, there have been other amendment movements. This is not a new solution to this issue. There are, I think, already 6 introduced in Congress. The way that this is different is it doesn't actually require, it doesn't say you have to put limits in place. It doesn't say you have to have disclosure laws. What it says is that the states should decide for themselves what their election laws should be. If what works in Maine doesn't necessarily work in California. One example of that is that there used to be in places in especially northern resource-rich states like Wyoming, Alaska, they have a history of outside interests trying to rig the system to gain access to those resources. And so they tried to pass laws that would say for every $5 of in-state money, you can $1 of out-of-state money. And all of those laws were overturned when the Buckley v. Vallejo ruling was handed down, and now they can't even debate and consider these laws because of the current Supreme Court precedents. So here's the amendment. It's very, simple language, but something they worked on for 5 years, going around the country with town halls, consulting the public and working with constitutional scholars. The optimal section is in section 2, basically saying nothing in this Constitution should forbid Congress or the states within their jurisdiction from reasonably regulating money in elections. And it has wide support, 76% of Americans across the political spectrum. I've been to very conservative events, very liberal events, and we get the same response. Basically, that support is flat across the political spectrum. Most people agree that we need to do something about our election laws, and we have support from former President Jimmy Carter, Olympia Snowe, former senator here in Maine. So both sides of the political spectrum, prominent politicians who are on board with this reform. And we are going state to state. 22 states have already called on Congress to pass this amendment, including Maine. Maine passed a resolution in 2013 and then again last year calling for this amendment. And I'm going to cut it short. We do a lot of work with Rotaries. This is, I won't play the video just for time's sake, but this is a Rotary governor who spoke at our annual convention this year, talked about how the 4-way test connects to this issue, and if any, I can send it around if the group wants to see it in their own time. Yeah, I think I'll just skip over to the end. That's it. I did leave some cards out, so if you're interested in getting more information, feel free to add your name, pass the card back, and we send out a bi-weekly, twice a month, we send out a newsletter. And happy to answer any questions if folks have them.
If I may.
Yeah.
You don't have to give me the clap. It's not.
Yeah.
How are you funded?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are entirely citizen funded. We disclose all of our donors. We put out an annual report with a list of all of our donors, and I'd be happy to share that with the group as well.
Share with me your perspective on Maine's regulations on clean election versus traditional candidates and how that process has influenced Maine, if at all.
Yeah, it's a good question. We try to stay singularly focused on the amendment and not wade into other types of reform, but certainly Maine has one of the best public financing systems in the country. Not everybody agrees with public financing of elections, so that's kind of why we try to stay in our lane. But what he's referring to is Maine has a system where taxpayers can check off a box on their taxes at the end of the year saying, I want to give $3 to the Maine Clean Elections program. That money goes into a fund, and candidates can access that money so that they don't have to go out and raise big dollars from special interests or big donors. They can instead collect these $5 checks from people in their district, and then they qualify for funds to be able to compete with some of the bigger candidates out there. I guess I am back here.
It was interesting that I guess it was the law that passed in Maine. Who were the people that went after it immediately after it was passed? And one of the ones you said was media, mass media.
Yeah.
They're the recipients of these billions of dollars. Man,
What a coincidence.
Right. So,
Yeah.
so how do you view that? I mean, it seems like that's your challenge. You got all these billions of money going to them. They're happy to spend the advertising.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the media is by far the biggest beneficiary of the money. They also have these rules in place that allow them to charge more for political advertising than some of their other advertising, so they have an incentive to sell as much ad space as possible to political candidates and issues, and they are going to fight tooth and nail. We do a lot of letters to the editor, and we've had a lot of luck getting letters published in local papers, but since this referendum passed last year, very hard to get a letter published in the Press Herald or the Bangor Daily News or the Lewiston Journal. Any of the big papers have taken a stand. They are aggressively against any sort of electoral reform, and they are part of this conglomerate of media groups that have joined the lawsuit, unfortunately. So yeah, we try to combat that by doing stuff like this. It's like going directly to the public and not having to invest in media, but rather going and doing more civic, more education, more grassroots education.
So one more thing there. I don't know if I have all the facts correct on this, but in Canada, I want to say that if you have a FCC equivalent license to be a broadcaster, you're required to give a certain amount of free time for political ads, whereby then candidates will have to produce so much money, then have all the strings attached to it. And so have you thought about the campaign of not only reforming, I'll say, the money side of politics, but trying to put some folks into other things like the FCC and the I'll say, similar thing that Canada's done?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I, again, try to stay in my lane when I'm talking with American Promise, but I have been involved in some other reforms, and there are a lot of examples from around the country of how they run elections. They limit election time to 2 or 3 months, whereas we've turned it into an entire institution, billions and billions of dollars, and it stretches on for now over a year typically, and people get totally burnt out. And one of the things I didn't talk about in the presentation, but I typically do, is that the vast majority of this money that is spent independent of candidates, the super PAC and the 501c4, 80% of all of that money goes towards negative ads, because it's easier with the way the law is written to run ads against a candidate than for a candidate. So they put the vast majority of the money towards negative attack ads. And that is part of the reason why people have lost faith in our politics, is because the narrative around it is so nasty. People don't want anything to do with it. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
That was great. We have a couple things for you. We have a
Wow, no way! Oh my gosh, this is awesome.
and we also have a certificate for you that you can.
Oh, wow. That is so cool. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah.